Okay, I hope I'm audible to all students who are attending this lecture of intermediate macroeconomics. We continue with our lectures on the open economy models. We continue with our lectures on open economy models. Okay, and if all students can recall that in the last lecture of open economy models, we were looking at the concept of balance of payments of an economy. We had seen that balance of payments is an account which captures the transactions of the residents of a country with the rest of the world. We had also discussed the components of balance of payments, which are the current account and the capital account. And we had seen when will the balance of payment be in equilibrium, when will we have a balance of payment surplus, when we will have a balance of payment deficit, and so on. Okay, so the book I prefer to follow for my lectures on open economy models, this is Dornbusch and Fisher. It's one of the most important books for lectures on macroeconomics. So this is the book I prefer to follow for lectures on the open economy models. And in this particular lecture, I intend to look at the concept of exchange rate. So let's look at the concept of exchange rates. After having understood the concept of balance of payments, the next concept in line is the concept of exchange rates. Okay, so obviously all students know the basic definition of exchange rate. So exchange rates are measuring the price of one currency in terms of another currency. Okay, so now let us look at what are the various regimes we have within the exchange rate. So the first regime, or I can say the first type of exchange rate, is nothing but the fixed exchange rate. Fixed exchange rate. Okay, so now let's understand what is a fixed exchange rate regime. Okay, so we can say that in this system, the foreign central banks stand ready. The foreign central banks stand ready to buy and sell their currencies, at a fixed price in terms of some other currency. So when we say that we are having a fixed exchange rate regime, that simply means that the exchange rate is fixed by the central bank. So any economy which follows a fixed exchange rate regime has the exchange rate which is fixed by the central bank, and that particular economy stands ready to buy and sell foreign currencies at a fixed price. So that means under the fixed exchange rate is not fluctuating on the basis of demand and supply. No. Under the fixed exchange rate, the exchange rate is of a particular economy is fixed with respect to the other currencies, and that particular economy will be buying or selling foreign currencies at a price which is fixed by the central bank of that particular country. Okay, so moving forward, we can say that thus under the flexible exchange rate, or I can say thus under the fixed exchange rate, there is complete intervention by the central bank. there is complete intervention by the central bank. Okay, so that means that when we talk about the fixed exchange rate regime, under the fixed exchange rate regime, the exchange rate is not determined by the market forces of demand and supply. Exchange rate is purely fixed by the central bank of that particular economy, and that economy stands ready to buy and sell foreign currencies at a fixed price. Okay, then moving forward to the next type called the flexible exchange rate. So let's talk about the flexible exchange rate. Okay, so in this system, the central bank allows the exchange rate. The central bank allows the exchange rate to adjust on the basis of market forces of demand and supply of the foreign currency. Okay, so when we talk about the flexible exchange rate, so in case of the flexible exchange rate regime, there is no intervention by the central bank at all. The central bank simply allows the exchange rate of the economy to adjust on the basis of the market forces of demand and supply. So I can say that thus, under the flexible exchange rate system, there is no intervention by the central bank. There is no intervention by the central bank. So I hope that students attending this lecture have understood the difference between the fixed exchange rate regime and the flexible exchange rate regime. Okay, so now moving forward, now we have some more terms which are similar to the fixed and the flexible exchange rate regime. So let's look at these terminologies under the exchange rate. So one is called clean floating. Clean floating. So these are fancy terms, but they are highlighting the same definition which we have just done regarding the fixed and the flexible exchange rate. Okay, so what is meant by clean floating? So we can say in a system of clean floating, the central banks stand aside completely. The central banks stand aside completely and allow the exchange rate to be freely determined. They allow the exchange rate to be freely determined in the foreign exchange market. So we can say that since the central banks do not intervene, in the forex markets, we can say that therefore the official reserve transactions are equal to zero. official reserve transactions are equal to 0. Okay, so the system of clean floating is exactly the same as the flexible exchange rate system. When we talk about the clean floating term, it simply means that in this system, the central banks stand aside completely. They have no role to play. The exchange rate is freely determined by market forces of demand and supply in the forex markets. And since we say that the central banks are not intervening at all, official reserve transactions are equal to 0. Now, students can recall from my previous lecture, we had a discussion on the official reserve transactions. Official reserve transactions are those transactions within the capital account of the balance of payment where the central bank buys or sells forex. So when we talk about official reserve transactions are carried out purely by the central bank when they decide to either buy foreign currencies or sell foreign currencies in the foreign exchange market. So since under clean floating, there is no role of the central bank, that simply means that official reserve transactions under clean floating are equal to 0. Okay, moving forward, let's talk about dirty floating now. Okay, but before going on to dirty floating or managed floating, let me look at one more line. Let us look at one more point within clean floating. So this was the first point. Let's look at the second point within clean floating. So in a system of clean floating, balance of payments is always 0. That means BOP will always be in equilibrium. That is, the exchange rate adjusts to make the current account and capital account sum up to 0. To make the current account and capital account sum up to 0. If you all can recall in the last lecture when we were discussing on the balance of payments, all of you could recall that BOP is said to be in deficit. Okay. When is the BOP said to be in equilibrium? Let me correct myself. All of you can recall BOP. So I'm writing it so that students become absolutely clear. Recall that a current account deficit in the balance of payments is exactly balanced by net capital inflow or capital account surplus such that their sum is 0, or a current account surplus is exactly balanced by the net capital outflow or capital account deficit such that their sum is equal to 0. These were the BOP equilibrium conditions. Okay, so a surplus in the current account is matched by net capital outflow, or I can say deficit in the capital account such that their sum is 0, or a deficit in the current account is balanced or matched by net capital inflow or capital account surplus such that their sum is 0. Okay, so that means what? That means that when we talk about the system of clean floating, exchange rates will automatically adjust so that your balance of payment will be in equilibrium. That means if there's a deficit in the current account, it will be matched by net capital inflow, or if there is a surplus in the current account, it will be matched by net capital outflow. So hoping that students have understood this. That means under clean floating, exchange rates will automatically adjust based on demand and supply so that BOP is in equilibrium. That means BOP is equal to 0. Okay, moving forward, let's now talk about managed or dirty floating. We have talked about clean floating. Let's now talk about managed or dirty floating. Okay, so let's look on to this. So under this system, now this is similar to fixed exchange rate system, but there's a slight difference. Let's understand this. Under this system, the central banks intervene to buy and sell foreign currencies. The central bank intervenes to buy and sell foreign currencies in the attempts to influence the exchange rate. In the attempts to influence the exchange rate. So thus, under dirty floating, or I can say under managed floating, the official reserve transactions are not equal to zero. The official reserve transactions are not equal to zero. So hoping that the students have understood this. When we talk about the managed or dirty floating, that means this involves intervention by the central bank. Under the system, exchange rate is not freely determined by market forces of demand and supply. The central bank intervenes by buying and selling foreign currencies in the foreign exchange market. That simply means that under managed or dirty floating, the official reserve transactions are not equal to zero, because central bank is having intervention in this case. So hoping that students have understood the concept of fixed and flexible exchange rate regime and the fancy terms which we have just seen called clean floating and dirty floating. Okay, so now moving forward, let's talk about more terminologies involved in exchange rate. So let's understand what is meant by devaluation. And guys, let's compare it with depreciation. So devaluation of currency, and we are comparing this with depreciation of currency. Okay, so let's understand the difference between the two. These are very important. Again, they are very important terminologies we use in the exchange rates. Okay, so let's understand what is meant by devaluation. So, okay, so we can say a devaluation takes place when the price of foreign currency under a fixed exchange rate regime are increased, or I can say is increased by official action. So this is the main line, increased by official action. So we say that devaluation of a currency happens under the fixed exchange rate regime when the government of the devaluating country knowingly or intentionally increases the price of foreign currency. I again repeat, devaluation of a currency happens under the fixed exchange rate regime when the government of the devaluing country intentionally or knowingly increases the price of the foreign currency. Okay, so we can say that this means that the foreigners pay less for the devalued currency. This means that the foreigners pay less for the devalued currency. Okay, so if I take an example, so for example, suppose $1 was equal to, hypothetically, let's suppose 50 rupees. Suppose $1 is equal to 50 rupees. Okay, and now suppose the government decides to make $1 equal to 60 rupees. Okay, the government decides to make $1 equal to 60 rupees. So you can see what is happening. You can see that which currency is becoming cheaper and which currency is becoming expensive. You can clearly see, we can say clearly, rupees are becoming cheaper. Rupees are becoming cheaper. Why? Because the foreigners initially were spending $1 getting 50 rupee worth of goods. Now they are spending the same $1, but now they are getting 60 rupee worth of goods with the same $1. That means with the same $1 in their pocket, they can now buy more goods in our country. That simply means that rupees are becoming cheaper in terms of dollars. In terms of dollars. So this refers to devaluation of rupee. Which is the currency which is getting devalued, guys? Rupee is getting devalued. And this is done by the official act of the government. That means the government is doing it intentionally. It is not done, devaluation is not happening because of market forces of demand and supply, guys. This is something important to understand. Devaluation happens only under the fixed exchange rate system. And we have just seen that under the fixed exchange rate system, we do not have market forces of demand and supply. Under the fixed exchange rate system, we only have the intervention by the central bank, or for that matter, the government. So when the government intentionally is increasing the price of the foreign currency, in terms of the domestic currency, we say that the domestic currency is getting devalued. You can clearly see initially $1 was equal to 50 rupees. Now the government intentionally has made $1 equal to 60 rupees. It's a hypothetical example which I have taken. You can clearly see that rupees have now become cheaper in terms of dollars. Why? Because initially foreigners were spending $1 getting 50 rupee worth of goods. Now they are spending the same $1, but they are now getting 60 rupee worth of goods. That means for the foreigners, rupees have become cheaper, and for the residents of our country, the foreign currency has become more expensive. So I can say that rupees have become cheaper in terms of dollars. Another way of saying it is that dollars have become more expensive in terms of rupees. Both mean the same thing. Okay, now let's look at depreciation. So depreciation of a currency takes place under the flexible exchange rate regime. Depreciation of a currency takes place under the flexible exchange rate regime. Okay, this means that the domestic currency becomes relatively cheaper. It becomes relatively cheaper in terms of the foreign currency. Or guys, I can even say that the foreign currency becomes relatively expensive in terms of the domestic currency. So again, guys, the example will exactly remain the same. No change in the example. For example, suppose $1 initially was 50 rupees. $1 was 50 rupees and now $1 becomes hypothetically 60 rupees. Now again, in this particular case, if you look at this, now this is not happening because of official act of the government. This is happening because of market forces of demand and supply. The reason has changed. Everything else is the same. If you look at devaluation, devaluation was happening because of official act of the government. Depreciation is happening because of market forces of demand and supply of foreign currency. So my conclusion still remains the same. Clearly, rupees are becoming cheaper in terms of dollars. Rupees are becoming cheaper in terms of dollars. So this refers to the depreciation of rupee. This refers to the depreciation of rupee. Okay, so hoping that students have understood this. Now guys, if you look at conceptually, devaluation and depreciation conceptually are the same. The only difference is that devaluation is happening in the fixed exchange rate regime by the official act of the government, when the government intentionally or knowingly is increasing the price of the foreign currency in terms of the domestic currency. Depreciation, on the other hand, happens under the flexible exchange rate regime. Depreciation happens under the flexible exchange rate regime, where the market forces of demand and supply and not the government causes the domestic currency to become relatively cheaper in terms of the foreign currency. If you look at the example, we can have the same example in both the cases. But in the case of devaluation, it is happening because of the government. Why will the government want to devalue? One of the major reasons for devaluing the currency would be to promote exports. One of the major reasons for devaluating your own currency in the world market is to promote more exports, which in turn is going to correct or improve the deficit in your balance of payments. So that is why governments of some of the economies knowingly devalue their currency, so that their currency becomes relatively cheaper and foreigners are buying goods or services from their economy, thus improving their balance of payment situation. Okay, so hoping that students have understood the difference between devaluation and depreciation. And guys, exactly the opposite will happen in the case of revaluation and appreciation. So I am now going to erase only the relevant parts. Okay. So if I just slightly change my analysis, we can talk about the reverse part. Okay, so I am just erasing that parts which are irrelevant now. Okay, so now we can use the same explanation and we can talk about revaluation and appreciation. So revaluation of a currency, and appreciation of currency. So guys, I can say that a revaluation takes place when the price of foreign currencies under the fixed exchange rate system is reduced by official action. This means that the foreigners pay more for the revalued currency. This means that the foreigners pay more for the revalued currency. For example, $1 hypothetically was 50 rupees. Now it becomes only 40 rupees. And this is happening by the official act of the government. Now, guys, you can see that rupees have now become more expensive compared to dollars because foreigners were spending $1. They were initially getting 50 rupee worth of goods. Now they are spending the same $1, but now only getting 40 rupee worth of goods. So I can say clearly rupees have become relatively more expensive. Rupees have become relatively more expensive compared to dollars. Rupees have become relatively more expensive compared to dollars. Therefore, we can say that there is revaluation of rupee. There is revaluation of rupee. On the other hand, guys, if we talk about appreciation, so I can say that appreciation of a currency takes place under the flexible exchange rate regime. This means that the domestic currency becomes relatively expensive. It becomes relatively expensive in terms of the foreign currency. Same example. $1 equal to 50 becomes $1 equal to 40. Now this is happening because of the market forces of demand and supply. Okay, it's happening because of the market forces of demand and supply. And our analysis still remains the same. Clearly, rupees have become relatively more expensive. Rupees have become relatively more expensive compared to dollars. Therefore, there is appreciation of the rupee. There is appreciation of the rupee. So it's only the regime which decides what's the term we use. If we use fixed exchange rate regime, the terms are devaluation and revaluation. If we talk about flexible exchange rate regime, the terms we use are depreciation and appreciation. Okay, so I hope that all students have understood this and have no doubts. Okay, so now if I ask you what is the impact of devaluation or depreciation on exports and imports? Okay, so devaluation or depreciation of the currency. So guys, you can clearly see the example which I had taken. Hypothetically, $1 is equal to 50 rupees. Now it becomes 60 rupees. So we can say that the domestic currency is becoming relatively cheaper for the foreigners. Domestic currency is becoming relatively cheaper for the foreigners. Therefore, exports rise. Since our currency is becoming cheaper for the foreigners, they will want to buy more goods and services from us, so our exports will go up. Why? Because they were spending $1 getting 50 rupee worth of goods. Now for the same $1 they spend, they are now getting 60 rupee worth of goods. That means for them, our currency has become more cheaper. They will buy more from us, so exports will go up. So I can write in a more detailed way, exports of the domestic country goes up. Okay, but the second point is that the foreign currency is becoming relatively expensive. The foreign currency is becoming relatively expensive. Therefore, imports of the domestic country falls. Why? Because if you look at it, guys, initially we were spending 50 rupees getting $1 worth of goods. Now we are spending 60 rupees to buy the same $1 worth of goods. So I hope you've understood. Initially we were spending 50 rupees to buy $1 worth of goods. Now to buy the same $1 worth of goods, I have to spend 60 rupees, 10 rupees extra. That means the foreign currency has become more expensive. That means we will reduce our imports. Okay, so we can say that devaluation causes the exports to rise. Exports we denote by X, rise, and imports, which we denote by M, falls. So devaluation causes an increase in exports and a fall in imports. On the other hand, if I talk about the other side, revaluation or appreciation of a currency, devaluation or the appreciation of the currency. Now let's look at this, guys. So again, $1 was equal to rupees 50. Now $1 becomes rupees 40. So what do we learn? Domestic currency, which is rupees, is becoming relatively expensive for the foreigners. Domestic currency is becoming relatively expensive for the foreigners. Therefore, exports of the domestic country falls. Exports of the domestic country falls, and I can say that the foreign currency is becoming relatively cheaper for us. Foreign currency is becoming relatively cheaper for us. Therefore, imports of the domestic country rises. Okay, so I can quickly revise this again. Okay, so you can clearly see that initially foreigners were spending $1 getting 50 rupee worth of goods. Now they are spending the same $1 but only getting 40 rupee worth of goods. That means for the foreigners, rupees have become more expensive. They will reduce their demand for goods and services, so exports from our economy will fall. On the other hand, if we look at it from the domestic consumers' point of view, they were spending 50 rupees to buy $1 worth of goods. Now to buy the same $1 worth of goods, they are only spending 40 rupees. They are spending 10 rupees less. That means foreign goods have become cheaper for us. Our imports will go up. So I can say that revaluation or appreciation causes the exports denoted by X to fall and imports denoted by M to rise. So hoping that students have understood the impact of devaluation or depreciation on exports and imports and revaluation or appreciation on exports and imports. Okay, so now moving forward, let's talk about the concept of real exchange rate. The exchange rates which we have been doing till now were nominal exchange rates. Let's talk about the concept of real exchange rate, which is more important for economists, because real exchange rate is going to measure the purchasing power. Nominal exchange rate is not going to capture the purchasing power between two countries, which is actually captured by the real exchange rate. So we can say that real exchange rate is the ratio of the foreign to the domestic prices. It is the ratio of the foreign to the domestic prices measured in the same currency. Measured in the same currency. So we can say that real exchange rate is used to measure a country's competitiveness. It is used to measure a country's competitiveness in international trade. It is used to measure the country's competitiveness in international trade. Okay, so when we talk about the concept of real exchange rate, it measures the purchasing power of one currency in terms of the other currency, and it measures how much a country is competitive in international trade. So how do we mathematically derive the expression? So first of all, we denote the real exchange rate by R. Okay, now PF is the price, general price level in the foreign country. Okay, PF is the general price level in the foreign country. If I multiply this price by the nominal exchange rate E, I will get the value in terms of the domestic currency. And if I divide this value by the price prevailing in the domestic country, I get something called the real exchange rate. So real exchange rate is not in terms of money. Real exchange rate is in terms of goods you can buy or units you can buy. So I'm again helping students to understand how we have derived this expression. What is PF? PF is the general price level in the foreign economy. If I multiply this price level by the nominal exchange rate E, I get the value in terms of the domestic currency. If I divide this value by the price prevailing in the domestic currency, I get the real exchange rate. It's like saying that suppose, for example, suppose the price level hypothetically, suppose the general price level abroad is $5. Or you can think of it like that. Suppose there is a commodity which costs $5 in US. And suppose the exchange rate between US and India hypothetically is 60. That means $1 is equal to 60 rupees. Okay, this means that the commodity which costs $5 in US will cost how much in India? 300 rupees. So I hope students have understood this. So $5 is the cost of a commodity in US. If I multiply by the exchange rate prevailing between rupee and dollars, which is 60, the same commodity in India will cost 300 rupees. Now suppose the price in India is, for example, let's suppose the general price level prevailing in India is 50 rupees. Suppose the general price level prevailing in India is 50 rupees. Then what is the real exchange rate? 6 units. The real exchange rate is 6 units. Okay, so hoping that students have understood this example in some sense. PF denotes the price abroad. You multiply by the nominal exchange rate, you get the value in terms of domestic currency. You divide it by the domestic price level, you get the real exchange rate or the purchasing power in the domestic country. So I can say where P denotes the general price level, P denotes the general price level in the domestic country. P denotes the general price level in the domestic country. PF denotes the general price level. PF denotes the general price level in the foreign country. And E denotes the nominal exchange rate. E denotes the nominal exchange rate between domestic and the foreign currency. So hoping that students have understood this. Okay. I hope all students are now clear with the concept of real exchange rate as well as the formula. So we can say that real exchange rate is nothing but E into PF divided by P. Okay, now let us talk about the concept of real depreciation and real appreciation. So if I just write the formula again for completeness, R is equal to EPF by P. Okay, so we can say that an increase in R implies real depreciation. An increase in R implies real depreciation of currency. This means that now we'll not talk about currency, we'll now talk about goods. Because real exchange rate is in terms of goods. So this means that the goods abroad have become relatively more expensive. Goods abroad have become relatively more expensive than the goods produced in the domestic economy. The goods abroad have become more expensive than the goods produced in the domestic economy. Okay, so in this case, what will happen? So we can say other things equal, people both home and abroad, are likely to switch their spending. They are likely to switch their spending to the goods produced domestically. Since guys, the domestic goods are becoming more cheaper. Okay, since the domestic goods are becoming more cheaper, or I can say that the goods abroad are becoming relatively more expensive, people, both the home economy people and the people in the foreign economy, both of them are likely to switch their expenditure from foreign goods to the goods produced domestically. Okay, this will increase the competitiveness. This will increase the competitiveness of the domestic goods. This will increase the competitiveness of the domestic goods. Conversely, I can say, a fall in R implies real appreciation of currency. When I say real appreciation, it means real appreciation of domestic currency. Here also I can say domestic currency. So real appreciation of domestic currency. This means that goods abroad have become relatively cheaper. Goods abroad have become relatively cheaper than the goods produced in the domestic economy. Therefore, I can say other things equal, people both at home and abroad, are likely to switch to the goods produced abroad. So I can say that this will reduce the competitiveness. Of the domestic goods. So hoping that students have understood this, how we interpret this. Okay. Now, guys, if you look at this, when will R increase? An increase in E or increase in PF, foreign price level, or a fall in the domestic price level implies that R will increase. On the other hand, fall in the nominal exchange rate or fall in the foreign price level or increase in the domestic price level will cause R to fall. An increase in R means real depreciation. That means goods abroad have become relatively more expensive than the goods produced in the domestic economy. So both the domestic and the foreigners, both the domestic consumers and the foreign consumers will switch their expenditure to the goods produced domestically. This will increase the competitiveness of our products in the world market. On the other hand, a fall in R will lead to real appreciation of domestic currency. This means that the goods abroad have become relatively cheaper than the goods produced at home. So both the home consumers and the foreign consumers would switch their expenditure towards the goods produced abroad because they have become cheaper. So this will reduce the competitiveness of the domestic goods in the world market. Okay, so hoping that all students have understood this. So guys, this is where I intend to stop in this particular lecture. Okay, the objective of this lecture was to cover the basic concepts of exchange rates and to introduce to all students the concept of real exchange rates. Okay, which will be used very often to compare the purchasing power across two countries. So this is where I intend to stop in this lecture. In the next lecture of open economy model, we will look at the trade in the goods market, the market equilibrium, and balance of payments. So basically, guys, in the next lecture, we will be combining balance of payments and exchange rates together. So the first lecture was on balance of payments. This is the second lecture, which is on exchange rates. In the next lecture on open economy models, we will combine our concepts of balance of payment and exchange rates to arrive at some valid results in our lectures on open economy models. So this is where I stop. Hoping all students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubt, you can unmute your mics and ask or call up, or you can mail me your doubts at divineschoolofeconomics@gmail.com. So this is where I stop in this lecture.